Welcome everybody to a special episode, and I grabbed a pencil, not a pen. Special episode of Monday Musings, which I still haven't checked which episode this is. I think it's 33 or something. It doesn't really matter. But I have somebody on the show for the first time ever. I've got Liam, aka Hemvar, who some of our community members probably know who he is because he's been around for a long time. Recently, you started doing your YouTube channel, Liam's Lyceum, where you're reviewing books and stuff. I don't remember when I asked you to first be on the show. It was probably like 3 months ago or something.
Yeah, it was
Um,
in April or sometime.
yeah, something like that. Because I wanted to talk book stuff because I don't often talk books on my show. Because mostly it's my vlog and I'm talking about like the shows that Chris and I are watching, stuff that we're doing with game development, and then also just like the stuff that we're doing around the house and Project Ram and stuff. Um, but I know you and I have a shared interest in books, but it's funny to me because you're reading now like I used to read when I was like late teens into my late 20s. Because when I left to travel in at the end of 2007, I had to sell my book collection because there was no way I could take that with me. So I had
Right.
like 1,200 books at that point that I'd built up over the course of like 15 years. I think I started collecting when I was probably around 12. Um, and my mom used to take me. I was homeschooled for a long time, and the only refuge I had from the dairy farm that I grew up on, which I really didn't like, was we would go to the library once a week in town, and my mom would let me just like fill up a brown paper bag of books, and so I would just go through and just grab like 10 books every week, and I would literally read 10 to 12 books on a weekly basis for a long time. And then just started collecting them. And then I remember back in the day, like before the internet and stuff, when you wanted to pre-order a book, you would have to go to your bookstore and you would know that the author had a book coming out, however many months down the road, and you would tell them, "Hey, I want to reserve a copy." They would put your name on a list, and then you'd get a phone call, like whenever the book came out, "Hey, your book's ready, come in," and you would go in and pay your, whatever it was for the book, and get it that way. Um, but I know you were reading a bunch of Forgotten Realms books. Was the big thing you were doing for a long time. How long's that project been going on?
So I started, actually, let's see. I read my first Forgotten Realms novel back in 2017, but it was only in, it was 2020, just 2020, like right when the pandemic hit, basically. It was March. I had already been reading some more Forgotten Realms novels, of course. I started reading more in like late February that year because I go sometimes not reading them obviously because I read a lot of other books. But then I was talking to someone else who makes a podcast, like a D&D like play podcast type
Hmm.
thing, and he was telling me that he was going to be making one based off some Forgotten Realms novels. And I was like, I really like Forgotten Realms novels, and it just got me thinking. And I was like, you know what, might as well just read all of them. And so I started blogging the experience. Yeah, it was early March, I think, of 2020. So it's just a little over a year.
And I forgot to mention at the beginning, what's the website for that?
So it's ForgottenRealmsReading.com. It's also called the Forgotten Realms Lyceum. I just like the word Lyceum, I guess.
That's it's an interesting word that not a lot of people use. How deep are you into that project? Like, do you think you're like a quarter of the way through, a third of the way through? Because there's a lot of
Um,
books.
I'm not even either of those. I'm not even 20% of the way through.
Okay,
So I've read a good chunk of the short stories because I use those as filler sometimes, and there's less of those, and they're obviously don't take as much time. But I've
right.
read about five Forgotten Realms novels at this point. Um, and there's technically 293 because that latest R.A. Salvatore book just came out this month.
Uh,
And then I add a couple like others to the list because there's like one Spelljammer book that takes place in the Forgotten Realms and one Ravenloft book that takes place in the Forgotten Realms. So
You just mentioned something that I was just thinking of. That's the one difference between Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms is that Dragonlance had a cutoff point where they haven't published anything. I don't even know when was the last Dragonlance novel, but Forgotten Realms, once it became like the de facto fifth edition setting, it they've just kept going with Forgotten Realms. But I remember there's over I think there's over 200 books in Dragonlance as well. I mean, anytime you start talking about the big D&D franchises, which are Dragonlance and Forgotten Realms, you're talking several hundred books. I don't think they've ever done that many with like Greyhawk or Eberron or any
No.
of the other settings, have they?
Um, Definitely not nearly as many. Forgotten Realms has by far the most, and Dragonlance has a huge number as well. I think Eberron has several dozen. Greyhawk probably. Back in the day, there was only two main Greyhawk
Right.
series. There was the Gord the Rogue ones written by Gygax, and then there was I think it's Rose Estes was her name. She wrote another series, and I heard they're absolutely terrible. And then like when Wizards of the Coast got the bought out TSR and got Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, they made a few novels based in Greyhawk based off of some like old adventures like White Plume Mountain and like Descent into the Depths of the Earth and stuff like that. Um, and those were different, but I haven't actually read any of those yet, though I have one. Um, but yeah, besides that, I mean, they have like a few books for Planescape, I think, as well, a few for Birthright, and I have Ravenloft, of course, and
Yeah, they
Spelljammer. There's
have a
only six for
lot.
Spelljammer,
Yeah, they have a lot
so
of series. I was just doing a quick double check. Yeah, they're right. It looks like there's maybe a couple dozen in Eberron. It says there's more than 190, so there might not be 200 in Dragonlance. But
close to
it
200.
says over 190, so I'm assuming that's the case. But I do want to say, because I haven't. You're covering a lot of books that are way beyond anything I've read. Obviously, there are things that I've read that you haven't read. There's. I think that's one of the most interesting things about when you talk about the fantasy genre in particular, because mostly you focus on fantasy, right? I don't think I've seen you do really any science fiction to date. Um,
Mostly fantasy.
yeah, it's mostly
I do try to
fantasy.
get a science fiction book in there from time to time, but I'm reading Foundation right now, actually. But
Oh man, that's hard. I actually, because when the show got announced, I was like, I've never read this series before. I need to actually read this. And I have found it to be a little challenging to read because the way it was written was serialized over a long
yeah,
period of time. And then he came back and like fixed things. And then it was like I had the same issue when I finally went and read Stephen King's Black Tower series right before the movie came out because I was like, I've only ever read the first book. I need to read the rest of these. And because he wrote those over such a, like a 30-year span of time, there is a massive difference in style between like the first book and the third book as an example, and then he went back and made changes George Lucas style to like the first book when he was finished because he was like, now that doesn't work anymore, so I got to fix all that.
right.
I haven't finished Foundation yet. I started into it, and I haven't finished, let's just put it that way. I have found it to be a little challenging to read, but I want to get it done before the show comes out because it'll help me at least a little bit more with understanding some of the setting. Um,
Yeah, that was my thought as well. So
yeah, and I've not read a ton of Asimov. I mean, he is a classic sci-fi author, but I've always, like you, I've always skewed more towards fantasy than science fiction. Now, I do have, and I've mentioned a few on your YouTube channel, like the and now I'm blanking out. The Foreigner series by C.J. Sherry was one of those
mhm.
series that has always stood out to me as like a really good classic sci-fi series. And then there's a lot of Zelazny stuff that was sci-fi, right?
Mm.
But it crosses the boundary of like hard sci-fi, and it's more just like a dude in space doing things in a sci-fi setting as opposed to
Yeah.
being hard science fiction. So I found those to be
Yeah.
more enjoyable. I don't like hard sci-fi. Like Larry Niven, some of his stuff, which is really
Oh yeah.
old. I have a hard time with Niven. Um, who wrote the Berserker series? Was that Saberhagen?
I
Um,
don't know.
that was another one that I had a hard time with, but I really loved. See, now
Yeah.
now I'm going to be talking about like really old stuff too, because Fred Saberhagen, if I'm not mistaken, also wrote. I'm going to go Google this while we're sitting here.
Yeah.
Saberhagen Sword series. Pretty sure he was the one who
A-
wrote the.
Asimov is definitely known for his hard sci-fi. I mean, he was. I mean, he taught some sciences at a university, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah.
Even so, I've only read one of his other novels, and it was The Gods Themselves, and I enjoyed it. It was really weird, but
I can't
it was
remember.
interesting.
it's been so long ago that I read Asimov that I really can't remember what I read of his. But
Uh,
Saberhagen wrote a series called the Book of Swords series called about the 12 swords of power forged by the gods and given
okay.
to humanity. It's another one I'll have to refer to you because it's got a lot of books in it. But anyway, hard sci-fi is difficult for me. That's why I've always liked the softer sci-fi like Zelazny because it's not about the science. It's more just about adventures in
Yeah.
space. Which is why I was glad to see you're reading like the Fafford and Gray Mauser stuff because whenever you get the chance, dropping back and reading John Carter of Mars is it's the same thing, but it's in space. It's just instead of swords and sandals, it's what did they call? If there is a term for it, it's there's a term for it.
um,
Um,
Along swords and sorcery lines. Yeah.
well, because there's
I mean,
sword and
you could call it science fantasy if you want,
yeah, but
but
there's sword and sorcery, sword and sandal, and then there's
and
like one for the John Carter of Mars line of books, and I really can't remember what it is. But those are great because they're a lot like that early pulp
hmm,
setting. And what blows me away about some of the earlier stuff is these guys were writing this stuff in like the early 20th century before we had ever sent people to the moon or anything else, and they're talking about
right.
laser swords and laser pistols and gravity and all this other stuff. It was just amazing to me um, to look at the way they were doing that stuff.
Yeah.
um,
I
well,
noticed that actually when I was started Foundation because like you mentioned, it was serialized originally, and the first one for Foundation came out in like 1942,
mhm.
and very early in the book he mentions nukes. I was like, they hadn't set off any nukes yet, so I was like, that's really interesting that he was just like on top of it, I guess.
Right, like paying attention to the scientific advancements that were going on at the time, and what was going on with the Manhattan Project. um, it's cool stuff. Um, what are you working on right now? Because I think I haven't watched your most recent video, which came out I think a couple days ago. What are you in the middle of reading right now?
So, like I mentioned, I'm in the middle of Foundation, and afterwards I'm gonna jump back into another Forgotten Realms novel. But I just finished the Dragonlance Chronicles the other day,
Ooh,
actually.
the
So,
first three.
yeah.
Yeah, the fourth one. I kind of feel like the fourth one is not necessary to read because they came back and did it years later.
Is that the
As
Summerflame one?
Yeah, it's the
Okay.
afterthought that I want to say they did it like 10 or 15 years later. I could be wrong in the timelines, but I know it was several years because they did that series and then they went on and did, and I don't know the chronological order, but they did like the Time of the Twins
Hmm.
and they did several other books and I think several other trilogies, if I remember correctly, within the Dragonlance series after they spawned that first trilogy. Um, where they dive deeper into what went on with between Raceland and Cameron and the Time of the Twins in particular. That's a dark that's a dark series because it's not the whole party. It's just those two guys off doing
Hmm.
their thing, and it's about the trials and everything else, and it's not fun. It's not Raceland in his search for power is a I don't know if they ever specifically say it, but I feel like he's like the most perfect example of like a chaotic evil. Maybe not chaotic evil, but he does everything is just from neutral evil is maybe the one I'm
Yeah.
thinking of. Neutral evil, because everything he does is just it's for me and my
Right.
power, um, and screw everybody else.
Yeah. Well, no, I didn't. He kept on saying that kind of like early on in the series, and I was like, I really didn't get like the message really didn't come through until the third book. Like maybe that's a slight spoiler, but like at the beginning of the book when he's with the rest of the people on the ship and he just like ditches, it's just like, okay.
See ya.
Like
Um,
well, I actually wasn't expecting it to happen because he was just all talk before. So
right. No, and he becomes quite yeah. It's yeah, not I don't want to spoil anything, but there's a journey there for sure with that character. So since you just finished that up, I mean, what do you think about the overall series? Obviously, you're going to do your reviews later, but just off the cuff.
so it's I have mixed feelings about it actually. So I feel like I mean I've been talking to a few other people and I feel like opinions differ, right? Of course, but
Sure.
I actually like the first book the most. Um, I don't know why. But I heard it's also the only book that was based off actual like Dungeon and Dragon sessions, and the second and third one were just written as novels.
I That's what
And
I've heard too, yeah.
yeah, so I just enjoyed the first one the most. It was kind of eventually what it was that really worked me the most was the writing itself, which is just it's not great.
Mm-mm.
There's like I couldn't even call it stylized because it's just very simple. I mean, it just kind of got on my nerves a little bit later on because I was like, it's fine. The first two books is fine, and the third book is just like the story's great. I actually really like the story. Some of the characters are really good. Other characters are just like, I don't know what you're thinking type of thing. But like, I really didn't like Gilthanas, for example. But I love Flint and Tasselhoff and Fizban. And Tanis kind of went downhill with me. I actually liked him in the first book, but in the
He
third book, he kind of becomes like one of my least favorites.
Well, and then he
So
gets a little too like he's too emotionally like torn between the two women in his life, and that becomes like a
all
little
over the place.
yeah, he becomes an emotional train wreck by as you get through the series. I'm gonna be interested to hear what you think about the Deathgate Saga, because that came after they had done Dragonlance and then the Dark Sword series, and by the time they get to the Deathgate, everyone says that that is like the pinnacle of where those two were at as writers, because kind of after that series is when they kind of went their separate ways and
Really.
started working on different projects. But I it's for me it's one of those series that's up there in my like top five, just in terms of fun. I mean, it's 7 books, which makes it kind of hard because it's like I also have a hard time. I have a hard time recommending the Wheel of Time to anyone because as good as it is, it's also what is it, 14 books? Like
15 books.
yeah,
Ridiculous.
it's not a simple trilogy or anything like that. It's like, oh no, you're going to be doing this for the next 6 months, if you dive into Wheel of Time, and then you're going to have questions, and you're going to be like, what, why? And then you're going to want to reread it, and just good luck, come back to me
Yeah.
in a year when you've done it a couple times. But 7 books is hard too. I like, 3 books is good. 4 books
Hmm.
can work. 5 books is kind of like that's the max I'm willing to recommend to someone
Yeah.
unless I know they really love to read because 5 books is still a pretty big commitment. I mean, you mentioned Xanth the other day as an example. I haven't. I mean, they're still going on as far as I understand things. Um,
Really.
and let me look here real quick.
I'm actually planning on starting the first Deathgate book next month. I'm planning on reading it with my brother, my older brother. So,
Oh, you guys are gonna read that series together? Oh.
we've read some books together, like we read some Niven together, and we're reading a series, the Spiral Wars series, which is a sci-fi series together. He likes sci-fi more than fantasy, at least right now. So, see what he thinks of Deathgate. See what I think of Deathgate. So,
Yeah, it's interesting, and you'll see some Easter eggs in there too. Now that you've read Dragonlance, yeah, it looks like there's 47 Xanth novels, and
thanks.
one of them, the 44th, came out this year. There's a 45th coming out in October, and then there's 2 more that are already forthcoming. Um, yeah, and that was originally started off as a trilogy, and then expanded into other stuff. I mentioned this on your YouTube channel too because Piers Anthony. Um, he had a lot of good work in his early days. I don't know how much you've dug into the guy, but he kind of went off into a perverted perverted old man um,
uh,
loophole at some point, and a lot of his more recent stuff has been criticized heavily for not being appropriate for the audiences that he previously wrote for.
right,
But man, his early stuff like Battle Circle, to this day, Battle Circle is one of those few science fiction novels that still stands out in my mind because it's like everything reverts from being technologically dedicated to we're going back to primitive barbarian, and it's all about the strength of your, and I think like one of the guys' name is the Stick, and it's all about this brutal warfare in a post-apocalyptic setting. But he also had some really good stuff beyond Xanth. but yeah, sorry, I'm rambling now. Back around to Deathgate. I'm gonna be really interested to see what you guys think of that because it's really good, but it's also really long and there's a lot to soak in. And they have, there's multiple worlds that they're getting into as well. So it's not like, say, Forgotten Realms where it's one world. They had
Right.
to develop multiple worlds for the essences. So the Earth planet, the air planet, the water planet, so on and so forth. And each planet has a book around it and a unique culture and unique setting. As a creative person, that's challenging. But when you've got a couple of people working together on something like that, it does make it a little bit easier if people are working on together. But I also look. I don't know if you pay attention to what Kevin J. Anderson is doing with Brian Herbert, who's the son of Frank Herbert, and they have continued the Dune series. For the past 20
Right.
years, they've been working on Dune novels, and they've wrote those together. I think they're going on 20 years as a working relationship. And they sit down and they take the outline and they're like, I'm going to take this half, you're going to take that half, and then they just go away and write the chapters and talk to each other a little bit in between, but they don't really do, from what I understand, they don't do a whole lot of communication until all the drafts are done. Then they combine the drafts and they start doing the editing process of going through and saying, okay, this works, this works, this works. But I also know that Kevin J. Anderson is extremely analytical, excuse me, in the sense that he outlines everything like down to the last detail and he just fills in the blanks. And I have a really hard time doing that. I tried to do it with Project Tram, um, and I had I was out, and it was like when I started writing the prologue, it was like, yeah, I'm just gonna write the prologue, and when it's finished, I'll go back to the outline and see where I'm at from there, because I'm so
Mhm.
not following any outline right now. Um,
Right.
so I just know that I need certain things to happen, and it's like I think it's gonna take 6 to 8 chapters, maybe it'll take 8 to 10 chapters. But I have a hard time writing to an outline like that when it's my own stuff. When I'm working on other people's stuff, it's not that big of a deal because it's a client. So you have to hit those marks. Um, I know I want to talk about your college degree. What was your college degree again? Because I don't remember what your degree was, but I know what one part you were studying Tolkien, which fascinated me.
So I only have an associate's right now. I'm still in school. So well, I took a semester off, but
Sure.
um, and so I only have my associate's is only in general studies. But the thing I had been studying most recently at school was philology, and Tolkien was a philologist, and so I don't know. Yeah, that's also something I study not just in school. It's just something I find awesome and great. I mean, I'm wearing my Gondorian shirt right now. So, and I have my stack of Tolkien books right here. So, but um, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of interest in. There's a lot of interest in a lot of things, but I mean, philology is just language. It's like what Tolkien used to create his languages in his books. And I also, as far as, I mean, I always thought that speculative fiction or even genre fiction or whatever you want to call it was worthy of notice. You know what I mean? Like you don't. A lot of people put it in. They're like, here's like when you have two. It's like you have your two sons, like, and you have your friends over for dinner, and it's like you put genre fiction in the closet, and then you introduce literary fiction to all your friends or whatever.
Oh man,
And I never appreciated that because that's super lame to be honest. Like that's not very eloquent, but I mean,
it's you bring
so
up a good point though because I remember probably 10 years ago when I was first starting to get into the writing circles. There was this sense that if you were writing fantasy and science fiction, then you're not that good of a writer, and like only literary writers are good writers. And it always drove me nuts because I was like, I see way more best-selling genre fiction than I do literary fiction. Like,
way more.
it's like how can you say that it's not better than literary fiction? Literary is more prose and the technicalities of language and whereas fiction and fantasy and genre is all about evoking emotions and telling stories that are exciting as opposed to being grammatically correct per se. I don't know. It's just always a funny thing to me. So the study of language that you're saying, so it sounds to me like you're saying that that's kind of what got you interested in reading kind of like fantasy and stuff beyond literary.
So, well, a lot of stuff, right? Because I mean, I find like genre fiction to be pretty enlightening in a lot of cases. Like I just read Howling Dark by Christopher Rocchio, finished it almost a week ago, and super philosophical, like insanely philosophical. Mostly classical philosophy, but has a ton of philosophy in it. But it's set 19,000 years in the future in space, and you know what I mean. In my mind, that's awesome. So, as far as like the language stuff goes, that was has always been connected to fantasy specifically, mostly because when I read Tolkien's works, I was like, oh, look, he says, I can't even like Ellen Sula or Omen Tielva, whatever. I just butchered that because it's not coming to me right off the
Better
top of
than
my
I
head. But
can.
Frodo says that to the elves, right, in the Fellowship of the Ring. I was like, what the heck is that? Like, that's not English. And I always just thought that was cool. And so like around the same time I read Tolkien, though my first Tolkien book was actually The Children of Hurin,
Yeah, I saw that
which
in your
is
video the other day.
and so I thought was awesome as well. But I around the time I read Tolkien and was learning more about him, he was a philologist. That was his day job. He did translations and he taught students like Old English and other things. And around that same time, I started taking Latin in high school. And Latin, well, English doesn't come from Latin. It has a lot of Latinate words in it that mostly come from French, actually. During that Middle English period when Old French was a big influence on English,
Hmm.
and I just thought it was always interesting to me to see the influence there, and also just to see like right, you can take a ton of words in English and they come from French or Latin, or of course French coming from Latin anyways, so they come from Latin originally anyways, and or you could even just take the relationship, right? I remember learning in Latin class the word were or vir, which means man. That's where the word virtue comes from. Um, and like, well, that sounds a lot like were as in werewolf. And were from werewolf does not come from Latin. Okay, but they're related because, of course, they're both Indo-European languages. And so I was like, that's really awesome. Like, how are these languages related? Like, how are these languages that the, ancient Romans were speaking and the Vikings were speaking related? You know what I mean? Because they're definitely far removed, but they're still related. You can see that relationship.
I've also, and there's only been a couple of movies, and I can't remember them off the top of my head, that has been addressed in a certain way in a couple of science fiction movies I think I've seen. And now I'm gonna really have to think back and get back to you on which movies that I am remembering this from. But there's this one where you have two people on kind of different parts of the world who have a similar root language, but it's evolved beyond because they've come down through the cycles. And if you transpose and then they travel and they can understand some of the basics. This is also explained. Oh, I think another good. I'm thinking of one off the top of my head. It's an older movie, but the original Stargate movie, I think does this well. Because when he goes to the other planet and he's looking at the symbols and he's trying to figure and he doesn't understand their language, but when it finally triggers for him, it's like, oh, wait a second, because here's these people have evolved, thousands of years beyond the Egyptians in our own world, but the root language was the same. So once he's able to tap into that, you can kind of translate it from there. Um,
Right.
it's also weird to me because since I'm not a linguistic by any means, but when I learned Spanish, I've now been able to pick up on, and I'm not able to fluently converse, but Italian has become decipherable now to me because there are a lot of similarities between Italian and Spanish. Um, and we have some friends who are Italian, and he does all of his Facebook videos and stuff, all his vlogs in Italian. And I find myself watching, this last year I've tuned in and watched most of them, and he's got subtitles and stuff. But it's interesting to me how since I've learned Spanish, I'm now able to understand portions of it. Not a lot, but maybe 25, 30% of some of the conversations because it's the same roots as Spanish. Um, but then there was also weird stuff when we went to Spain, where in Catalan in particular, because they speak a different in Catalonia they speak Catalan, and
Hmm.
which is a mixture of French, Latin, and
Yeah.
Spanish, and it's really weird because you kind of think that you can understand, like as a Spanish speaker, it's like you kind of make out a
Huh.
word here and there, but it's also it sounds somewhat Spanishy, but it also sounds somewhat not Spanishy, and so Chris and I were both sitting there
Right.
going, "What?" You know, it's it's
Yeah.
it's really cool how languages have evolved like that, and how those influence
Yeah.
the evolution.
It's easy to see, or it's easier to see rather in Europe since I mean, in a case of like a Christmas song "Fum Fum Fum" is Catalan originally. Maybe it's Occitan. But Occitan is another one of those languages that's spoken right by where they speak Catalan, you know. And so it's just like it's its own language, but it's really similar to other ones. It's a weird in between. I mean, also similarly, that Dutch is very similar to English. It's like the in between of German and English, and it's smack dab in between Germany and England, you know. And so it's just like,
Makes somewhat sense, yeah.
yeah. So
Do you think I was just thinking about this too. I wonder because thinking about one of the more recent examples that people can look to is like The Witcher as a book series, which was written in Polish, right, as opposed to books that have been written in English. Because I have found that culturally, in Spanish speaking countries, the humor is different. There's a lot of differences culturally, based on the language and the way people think when they're speaking, because you do
hmm.
have a different thinking process. I've not read a lot of, and I'm going to use this in air quotes, I've not read a lot of foreign fiction. And by that I mean fiction that's not in the English language. How much are you intimate with any sort of non-English stuff that's then translated into English? Because
Not a lot, and most of it's like older variants of English.
sure,
But even then, you can see it. Like even then, like Old English has a ton of words for lord and king and warrior and man, like tons and tons and tons, like way more than we'd have. They have leftovers of a ton of words for horse. You know, when even though the Anglo-Saxons weren't really horse people, you know, their ancestors were, and so you can even see it then. I mean, even just looking at a dictionary for another language, you kind of get a feel, like because, and that's why I always found language so interesting because it's so important culturally. Like that's how you think. I mean, you think through language.
hmm
I mean, that's how you do everything is through language. You know what I mean? If you're just sitting there like cooking some eggs or whatever, you're thinking, oh, I got to turn this down. You're thinking it in English, at least in that case, right? Or you could think it in whatever language you want, you know, or that you can, of course. And so I always just thought it's so important, which is why I study old languages because I'm like I want to understand English as best as I can. Now, don't get me
sure.
wrong, I also study other languages, but just to me, it's just like I want to know, like and it's actually useful in a lot of literary senses because literary works, literary uses of words, will use archaic words like, oh, I can say way more often because we'll never use them in speech. So they'll use archaic words that we never use in speech. And I mean, I have a list of archaisms, English archaisms. It's like 1,100 words long, and I
Man.
add to it like every other day. And it's just like, hey, look, what's this word mean that I don't use, I've never used in my, you know, like I generally like, you know, like Tad Williams will throw in some random archaic word and like, hey, let me look that one up real quick or whatever it is. So,
He's an interesting. I've followed him for a long time. And one of the things I like about Ted Williams is he's very active on social. Well, he's active on Facebook, so he does the readings every single night. But him and his wife Deborah have always been, yeah, they've ran their own website, they've had their own forums. It's I like not all authors do that. Not all writers take the time to have a social presence. I don't know if you've ever read anything by what is Elie Modisette Jr. I think is his name. I might be butchering the pronunciation.
Haven't yet. No, he does the recluse stuff,
Yeah,
right?
the recluse. Yeah, that the Chaos War stuff, the Recluse series. He's a really good author, but he's an older gentleman, and I think he's in his late 70s now. Perhaps I haven't looked in a long time, but he's one of those who just has had. He's got like no social media presence. Whereas Terry Brooks, on the other hand, Terry Brooks has done a very good job even in his old age. Like I remember meeting
He's not young.
Brooks. Yeah, I met Brooks at in '99 at the Star Wars Festival, the first Star Wars Festival in Denver, because he wrote the novelization of the Phantom Menace, and so I got all four hardcovers, got them signed, and I was like, I think that was my first big author moment when I met a big fantasy author who I had read, the Sword of Shannara and all the books up to that point, and I was just like in awe. Um, but yeah, other people, it's like they're like Dan Simmons is a good example. Dan Simmons, he used to run a writing workshop in Colorado, but he has next to
Oh.
no social media presence. He just is, uh, he just doesn't want that. And I'm like, damn it, you need it.
It really does help in a lot of cases. I mean, and especially I feel like when you want to understand something, but when you have like a author that doesn't have like super popular works, I mean, like it's kind of nice just to be able to like, hey, explain this to me because I can't even ask someone else that's a fan or
Yeah, that's a good
you know, just
example.
like,
Stackpole, Michael A. Stackpole, I think is his name. He did a bunch of Star Wars novels back in the day. Also did this great standalone novel called Talion Revenant, which I love. He's had a Patreon, and he basically has taken over like all of his old publications and got the rights back and has been self-publishing. And
that's nice.
then he's been going back into his old catalog and just taking all the works that like he did when he was getting going and weren't selling, and no one wanted anything to do with. And he's like, hey, I got a big enough fan base, I can, I'll make these through Patreon and have it work that way. Um, and then I follow Kevin J. Anderson because I really I appreciate he's done some really good seminars on productivity and using voice to text, which I adopted. Not his manner, but I mean I use naturally Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a little bit different than what he does, where he's dictating into a recorder and then he hands it off to an assistant who then types it all out. Um, but I've always appreciated him from a productivity standpoint because he's just done like a ridiculous amount of novels over the course of his
Hmm.
30-year career. It's like 160 or something. It's a ridiculous amount.
Oh,
Um,
geez.
it's no, it's like 3, 4 books a year, sometimes more. It's
Yeah,
stupid the amount he does. But he does
yeah.
religiously. He goes on a hike every single day and does 2 chapters religiously every single day. That's
That's
two
pretty cool.
chapters, which is 4,000 words, sends it to his typist, comes home, sits down, and starts editing on whatever is the previous project that's currently in the editing
Yeah,
phase to get published. And so he works at 8 to 10 hour day, and he
yeah.
breaks it up into between what I'm writing now, what I'm editing now, and what I'm editing for there, or what I'm proofing. Plus he runs
Huh.
like a course. I don't know, man. Some of these guys are
It's
insanely busy.
people like that I'm just like when people say Brandon Sanderson's a fast writer, I'm just like, I don't know. There's a lot of other people out there that are way faster. Like Asimov had something like 400 novels published in his lifetime,
Yes,
something
yes.
ridiculous. I mean, that's crazy. And I mean, like I always appreciate. It kind of goes to the both topics you were just talking about, like Ed Greenwood, who has an amazing presence on Twitter. If you ever have any Forgotten Realms questions, and but he also he when he actually has to write something, which he doesn't write them all that often, sadly anymore. But like he wrote the first Elminster novel in like 3 weeks, I think, or something like that, and which is great. It's a great novel anyway. So, but I mean, to me that's crazy because I can't write that fast. Like
I've
half the
I
time I have a hard time finishing stuff.
Yeah, I've had projects where I can get through it really quick, but most of the time, because I have other things that I'm doing. If all I did was write full time, it's not that hard to be productive. It's just a matter of having the time to do it, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, because unless you're a full-time writer, you don't have 10 hours a day to sit here and just write. And so if you have, I mean, even Sanders is a good example. His earliest books were written when he was a night shift, as I recall, night
Hmm.
shift clerk at a hotel. And so he took the night shift specifically so that he could work on the books at night when there was not a lot of people around, so that he could have a job that paid the bills and be able to write while he was doing the job, which is a brilliant strategy as an FYI because it allows you to
Yeah.
carve out like 4 to 6 hours a day to just write. But I've had a couple of 10,000 word days, but they're not, man, I don't know if I could do that every single day. But it just depends because if you really sit there for 8 hours a day and you do 1,000 words an hour, you're going to write 8,000 words a day. And that's a very realistic goal. I mean, you talk to anybody like Stephen King or any of the big guys, and they always say, just sit down for 3 or 4 hours a day and try to do, 1,500 to 2,000 words of like reasonably solid copy. It's not perfect, but it's also
Mm.
not shit. It's reasonable. And just as long as you can get like 1,500, 2,000 words a day, and you do that every single day, then you've got a 60, you've got a 120,000 word novel in 2 months if you do that
Right.
religiously. And that's realistic.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
realistic, but I mean, you can't still commend them for the persistence. You know what I mean?
Yes,
Like,
I don't do it every single day. I've
right.
tried to do it every single day, and there are some days when I'm just like, like I'm just not feeling it. Like I sit down and it's not writer's block. It's that I'll write something and then I'm like, I don't like where this scene is going. Um, Feist is a good example of this too, because he does somewhat stay active on Twitter, but he's an old man now, and he talks about being an old man and like forgetting shit and the
He's still
difficulties.
writing books, isn't he?
Yeah, he finished the Rift War stuff like 4 or 5 years ago, and he started a brand new series, which I think he's working
Uh,
on the third book right now in a brand new series.
yeah.
Um,
Brooks did a similar thing with Shannon. Just finished it and is
yes,
starting new stuff.
yeah,
I mean, they're getting old though,
yeah. Both these guys are in
so
their 70s, so it's like who wrote? I'm gonna have to look this up. And I know we're 40 minutes in, so we got to wrap this up, or your wife's gonna kill me. Um, the Beryllian series.
he doesn't know where you live, so it's fine.
That's good. Oh, and I'm gonna
Actually, heard this is a little off topic, but I heard that was it Steve Perrin passed like yesterday or something.
I'm
An
not.
old D&D like module writer and some RuneQuest too, I think. I'm not really sure. I have a book right here by him, which is why I just thought of it. But it's a choose your own adventure book. So,
I'm not intimately familiar with him. Man, and I'm blanking on who this is now, but and I can't. I'll find it at some point. He wrote a bunch of fantasy books that were first person that I really loved, and I can't remember the names of the books now. But he was another. He wrote until he was in his 80s. It's gonna drive me nuts that I can't remember. Um,
is it yeah?
David something or other.
Oh, Eddings?
Yes, thank you, David Eddings.
Okay,
Um,
that's like David something who wrote books a while ago. I read his Belgariad
Thank you.
before.
That's I couldn't remember what it was called. I was literally typing stuff into Google and I'm like Berliand, Barrelond. It's like I knew it was Barrel something. So yeah, because he wrote up until late in his life, and yeah, late 70s, and he stayed all the way up until the end, like very prolific. And his work, he's another entertaining writer. I wouldn't call his work super deep, but it's entertaining.
Yeah,
And it's a lot of it's first person, which a lot of people are like, people that write in first person are not good writers, and I'm like, I don't care if it's entertaining. Um, so who
it's
cares?
fine. I
Um,
generally read third person, but first person's fine, of course.
yeah, I'll read anything. But it's been interesting. One of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show, I do want to wrap this up so that it doesn't go too late. Um, One of the reasons I wanted to have you on was because I know you have a heavy appreciation for good fiction, and that's something that I share, even though it's not as much these days as it used to be, because unfortunately, as an older individual, I've gotten sucked into video games and Netflix, which take up more of all the time that I used to spend reading up until my late 20s. I now spend playing video games and watching Netflix shows, which is on the one hand the evolution of the entertainment industry has allowed for stories to be told in a lot of different mediums now, as opposed to back in the day. We didn't have video games, we didn't have Netflix, and so on and so forth. So the only option that I had to get my fantasy fix was to read fantasy books, because the movies, there were some movies that were really good. Of course, Star Wars and things of that nature. But um, the streaming generation, it's just there's so much sci-fi, which I watch way too much of. Chris doesn't like sci-fi as much as I do. In terms of, it's funny because I don't like sci-fi books that much, but I love sci-fi TV and sci-fi films. Um, but book-wise, um, coming back around to the more modern stuff, I've actually not kept up with modern fantasy. Like I used to, anything that came out from Tor or Forge or any of those publishers, I would, pre-order and read a lot of that stuff. But I think I quit doing that in the late, right in the late aughts, right around 2006,
Hmm.
2007 when I stopped collecting books. Like Sanderson, the only thing I've read by Sanderson is his Wheel of Time stuff, and I think he has a standalone novel, Elantris, I think is what it's called, um,
Yeah.
which I read, but I haven't read the ongoing series that he's writing right now. I think The Way of Kings is maybe what it's called. Um, I've not read those books, and I know I used to follow his blog when he was working on the Wheel of Time stuff, and I do as a writer, he's a fun character to follow because he's very active on social media, and I like the way he
Yeah.
tracks everything, and like does word counts for his readers, and you're just all just kind of sitting there going, "Holy shit!" Like, obviously there are other people who are more prolific than him, like Kevin J. Anderson's a good example, but it's also impressive when you see guys like that, because then you have um, the Name of the Wind guy, Patrick Rothfuss. It's been
Yes.
10 years or
Rothfuss.
whatever. Oh, his editor, I loved the editor. She wrote something on Facebook a few years back where she basically just said she doesn't. She's like, what the fuck, Come on, man. Like you need to just finish it. Like she basically chewed him out, but then also said, I'm here whenever it's ready. I love your work, but you need to just get it done. And I also feel the same about George R. R. Martin, because I quit reading The Wheel of Time because I'm like, I'm not going to wait 7 years between books. Like, if you can't get it out in 2 years, then I'm not going to give you money to, like, I'm just going to wait until you
Yeah,
finish it.
yeah. Why commit when you're gonna have to wait half a lifetime or something to finish the series?
Yeah. All right. Well,
In some cases.
when's your next review going to be out on YouTube?
I actually have a review going live tomorrow for Elric of Melniboné, the first Elric book by Moorcock. So,
Moorcock is deep, man. That's some of his early stuff too. Um, I haven't read any of that stuff in a long time. The Elric stuff. Cool.
I'm trying to get I'm trying to, well, I don't even broaden my horizons. I have broadened my horizons, whatever it's William Morris from like the 1880s fantasy up till, Sword and Sorcery, which I think is underappreciated these days,
It's
or even
way
science
underappreciated.
fantasy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I started reading Marion Zimmer Bradley a couple months ago, and I want to read a ton of
MZB.
people. So,
Yeah. The not the Albion series. That's another writer. The King Arthur series, and it's not called the King Arthur series.
oh yes, The Mist of Avalon. That's
The
the first
Avalon
book, at
series.
least.
Thank you. The Avalon
Yeah.
series, and they did a good miniseries on that years ago as well. A very good adaptation for television. But MZB, she used to edit an anthology every year, and I
Yeah.
can't remember what it's
Yeah.
called now. For
Isn't it called
years.
something similar to like? So it's similar to Sword and Sorcery, though. I know that. Maybe it's called. I don't remember.
MZB, and she was part of the Society of
These
Creative
World.
Anachronism.
I'm gonna be reading These World next month. Actually, the first one.
Oh, that's such a
And
good book. Um, what was the name of MZB's anthology? Sword and Sorceress? Or no?
maybe that was it. Was something like along those lines. And I've seen a couple copies of that, but I don't have
Yeah,
any. I have mostly heard Darkover
it's
stuff.
the Sword and Sorceress anthology. She did 30 of them. Um,
Jeez.
But yeah, it's like it's just some of these anthologies. There's also one if you ever get a hold of it. It's called Legends. It was edited by Robert Silverberg, and
uh,
it's got like stuff in it by it's got a short story by Raymond Feist from the Rift War. It's got a Tad Williams story in there. It's got a George R. R. Martin story in there.
oh yeah, I've heard about that.
It was in like the late 90s, maybe early 2000s. It's got like a cream colored cover. I don't know. I have the hardcover somewhere.
I saw a hard copy at my bookstore once and I didn't buy it, and I
It's
feel
worth
kind
it.
of bad for
It's
that.
worth
I
it.
should.
It's got some really good short stories in it for sure.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get back to more Williams, especially the Witchwood Crown. It might be next year, honestly, because I have so much to read. I'm hoping to start Zelazny this month and C.S. Lewis since I've read neither of them. Um, among other authors, of course. So
Yeah, you got your work cut out for you. All right.
sure
Well,
do.
everybody who's following along, there's going to be links below, but you can check out your Liam's YouTube channel. It's called Liam's Lyceum, as I'm pronouncing it correctly. And what was your website again? The Forgotten Realms one?
ForgottenRealmsReading.com.
.com. So folks can go over there and check those out at your leisure. Get some good book reviews. Of course, follow them along at Goodreads as well. And I'll get all those links in the description text below for everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. We went way over. We went like double the time that I usually go for these Monday Musings episodes, and I feel bad now because I said I was going to do 30 minutes and we went to 50. So,
That's fine. She'll be okay.
all right. Well, thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you next week. Stay tuned. Till next time.